So next week, AARP is going to bring us two programs. Tuesday morning
Well,
at 10 o'clock, I think.
I'm serious.
Jim, can you mute yourself? Next Tuesday at 10 will be Prepare to Care by ARP. And then, and that's both you as a receiver of care, what you need to do for your house and your papers and, you know, legal things, as well as you as a caregiver. And then next Friday at 1 is fraud prevention, also presented to us by AARP. Both of those you have to register for. So go on into the link and get registered. They have things they want to send you. And they want to know that there are enough people to inspire them to greatness in their talks. And then December 10th at 1 o'clock, there's going to be two ASU professors will give us a review of the history of plagues. And I'll be sending out a notice about that on December 1st. But, and then I'm going to take a break until probably the end of January and start up with programming again, the end of January and back in February. So with that, today we have Willard Watson of the Blowing Rock Museum of History and Art and History Museum going to recap for us a talk that he gave last year and on apples of Cone Manor. So Willard, thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good morning, everybody. Good to see some of y'all again and some new faces. Jim, we were on a talk, you were on the talk yesterday about the Koala Arts over at BRAHM, and Karen, it's good to see you again. So yeah, I'm Willard Watson III. I work at the Blowing Rock Art and History Museum as Programs and Outreach Director. And normally in the fall, we have a talk with an apple tasting. So been doing that the past few years, and it's nice you get to try a bunch of apples and then take some home with you after you're done. But it's not really COVID appropriate. But I'm going to tell you about the apple history here and tell you about a place that you can taste some of, like purchase some of the apples we're going to talk about today. So just a quick show of hands. You know, who here knows that Western North Carolina is a historic like apple hub, you know, of apple growing region? Okay, y'all, great, most of y'all do. Now, how about, did you know that the Cone Manor was an apple or growing place, and you know, was developed to grow apples? It's great, so some of y'all did. So I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, and my experience with apples up until I moved up here was just what I could get from the grocery store, you know, Granny Smith's or Red Delicious. And I always thought the name Red Delicious was an oxymoron because it just wasn't delicious. So I didn't really like apples. And then when I was a sophomore at ASU, I was lucky enough to get an internship with the Blue Ridge Parkway, where I drove up and down the length of the parkway and tagged every apple tree I found within 50 feet of the road, and got to collect samples and taste every apple I found along the way. And I just tasted such an incredible variety of flavors, from apples that tasted like honey to apples that were so bitter they were called spitters because you just spit them out, and they were good only for feeding cows and deer. So it's just amazing to me the variety of apples that we had, and that really kind of started my introduction to learning about the region here and how it's been a historic hub for growing apples. Now, the first picture that we have here is a picture from the National Park Service, and it is looking through some apple trees in the foreground to Cone Manor in the background. Now, this was from the late 50s, early 60s. And one thing that sticks out to me immediately is that these apple trees in the foreground have not been pruned in a while. And so with apple trees, if any of y'all have apple trees, do any of y'all have apple trees on your property or fruit trees? Okay, a couple of y'all. So you really got to prune them regularly if you want any type of yield or an even yield of apples in your trees. But then once you start pruning, you can't stop pruning. It's really kind of one of those like vicious cycles. But so these trees have not been maintained well. They're overgrown. There are a couple apples you can see on them, but it's a little sparse. It's not like what it would be if they'd actually been pruned. And then in the background, you can see these little puffs on the landscape, and those are more apple trees in front of the Cone Manor. And so even though it's a little overgrown, you can still see how they're kind of intentionally planted, and there are some rows. So we'll see some pictures coming up that kind of show this better. But Western North Carolina is an apple growing region, and really before the advent of refrigerated storage and refrigerated cars, which were able to make like Washington State, the apple breadbasket of America, Appalachia was the place where the Eastern Seaboard got their apples. The Blue Ridge Parkway actually crosses through a lot of the best apple growing regions. When I did my research, I found over 500 trees along the 200-mile expanse, or 500 locations with apple trees. Some of them were single trees, some of them were whole orchards. And so it makes sense that when Moses Cone was developing his intentional, farm landscape, he was going to seek out apples as being a prime crop. Well, this is the story of apples at Cone Manor, excuse me, is a story about two people. It's a story about Moses Cone and his wife, Bertha. So for those of you that don't know about the Cones, Moses was a first generation Jewish German immigrant. His parents came over from Germany, and his father, Herman Kahn, actually changed the family name to Cone to Americanize when they came to the US. And excuse me. So the family business at that time was groceries. The Cones settled in Jonesboro, Tennessee. They started a grocery business, and Moses and his brother Caesar started working for their father selling groceries and traveling as traveling salesmen when they were early teens. So Moses never finished school, but by the time he was 14, he was on the road with his brother. And there's some really great historic images of the three of them. They were on cigar boxes because they sold everything from collard greens to cigars. You could buy it through the Cone grocery. Well, they became really successful doing business. They ended up moving to Baltimore, and the Cone grocery business was just booming. And then Moses and his brother Caesar saw a future in producing denim. So they actually moved down to Greensboro. They set up Cone Mills. And this was a time when places would make fabric, but it wasn't finished products. It would just be big reams of fabric. And so Moses and Herman, they started a business where you could actually get finished denim products through them and kind of revolutionize that. They made so much denim that they were known as the Denim Kings. And there's actually a great documentary that ASU professor Beth Davison has done called The Denim King. And it chronicles Moses and Caesar's rise to greatness through producing denim. And the Cone Mills in Greensboro is and it's such an expansive mill. I mean, and it could do everything. At one end, there were horse-drawn carts bringing in large bales of fresh cotton from the fields. And on the other end would be reams of denim being rolled out or finished clothes. But Moses was a workaholic, and he kind of worked himself to an early grave. He died at the age of 51 in 1908. And it was just a few years after he'd finished constructing Flat Top Manor. And so this left Bertha with the home place. And when Moses moved to Blowing Rock, he was trying to construct this intentional landscape and transition from being this, denim mogul and traveling businessman to a farmer. When the census came through in the early 1900s, and they logged Moses as being a resident of Blowing Rock, he listed his occupation as farmer, which is just kind of funny because he had established this like business empire, and here he is saying he's a farmer. But he really he used his kind of business acumen and that look for streamlining just systems management, and took that approach to being very intentional with designing the layout of Cone Manor. So if you have been to Cone Manor, you know that there are 26 miles of carriage trails. There's like 30,000 acres of land there. And this was all really developed so that way they could use the land to make money off of it through fruit. So here's an article from 1899, right? Fruit culture, Mr. Cone's work at Blowing Rock, this state. So science and money applied on the growing of apples, an extensive experiment over 25,000 apple trees planted. Mr. Cone's place on Flat Top Mountain surpasses Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate in altitude and beauty of location. So Moses was definitely part of the Gilded Age, and he looked at his contemporaries in the Gilded Age and didn't want to have the same type of home that some of these people would build, these just extravagant, lavish places like the Biltmore estate. When you look at Flat Top Manor, it's a very humble place compared to his contemporaries, even compared to Moses's brother, Caesar, who had just an incredible home up in the Catskills. But so for Moses, the big thing was not having this lavish mansion, but having a landscape. They were building a view with what they did. They were building industry. And you think about 25,000 apple trees planted. He was buying these trees from local nurseries. There are receipts in the National Park Service archives that have the logs from nurseries in Lenore and Newland that he would be buying these apple trees and peach trees and cherry trees from. And they were selling them by the dozen for a couple cents, but still thinking 25,000, that's a lot of money to go into the local economy. And then here is another advertisement showing about the mountain apples. So this ad is from Greensboro Daily News in 1914, and they're talking about Miss Moses H. Cone. So this is after Moses had passed away, and Bertha was going, is just the time she was Mrs. Moses H. Cone instead of Bertha Cone, but just letting people know, like skip the middleman, come get your apples straight from the orchard or purchase them from these department stores. So it's just really incredible thinking about this Watauga County being known as the lost provinces, as this place is so incredibly remote. But here we have 1914, this advertisement in a Greensboro newspaper telling people to come up here to buy their apples. So then these are some pictures, some renderings, I guess, of apples that were done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And they actually sent artists to Cone Estates to draw these apples. So these are varieties that they would grow on the orchard: the Gloria Mundi, the Grimes Golden, and the Royal Limbertwig. The Gillipan, the York Imperial, and the Mother Apple. Now see, like these apples all have very different characteristics, very different flavors, very different origins. And I said earlier, growing up, I'd only ever had like 3 or 4 different types of apples. Well, that's just because that's what our industrial food system has provided us with today. If we look back in time, there were actually over 15,000 varieties of apples logged in historic seed catalogs. And that has to do with a couple different things. One, only certain varieties of apples ship well. There are some apples that are just very delicious, but they bruise incredibly easily or they turn really quick. They're only good when they're crisp. Right? A transparent apple is an example of that. It's an early season apple. It's really soft. And if you get it when it's fresh, it's crisp, it's delicious, but after a couple of days, they get really mealy. Then there are other apples like a Arkansas Black that is only good after it's been aged for a while. When you pick it, it's hard as a rock. But come February, they're edible. They get a little softer. Maybe it's more of a baking apple. But so there are so many apples that have different uses. Some apples are better for baking. Some apples are better for eating fresh. Some are better for cider or for making apple butter out of. And different communities would have their treasured apples. And it's also a thing too, where people were so isolated at this time, where what was the name for the York Imperial in one holler might be a totally different apple when you go the next mountain over. But we have logs that show just the names of the apples, and they grew over 180 different varieties of apples at the Cone Estate. They also grew quinces and plums and cherries and peaches and pears. I mean, anything that grew on a tree, they were growing it. They grew blueberries as well. Here's a picture from the 40s of a carriage in front of Cone Manor, and you can looking out on Bass Lake. And here you can see a very maintained orchard. All those trees in the foreground in those nice, neat rows are apple trees. And so then, and so here we have, next couple things I'm going to show you are some receipts for shipping. And so this is just kind of interesting to me because you're seeing the physical, these artifacts of the apples traveling. So this receipt from Southern Express, it says received from Mrs. M.H. Cone and marked Miss Etta Cone, Baltimore, Maryland. So this was Bertha sending a barrel of apples to her sister Etta in Baltimore. Now, some interesting things to note on this. One is that it was 68 paid for charges. That's 68 cents to ship a barrel of apples to Baltimore. Now, this time is 1913, so I was just going on an inflation calculator earlier. Now, 68 cents in 1913 translates to about $19 or $20 today. And one barrel of apples is 300 to 350 apples, depending on how many you packed in there. Now, Moses was very scientific with his approach to the apple business, and he brought in USDA scientists to help him develop his orchards and brought in food scientists from NC State to help him figure out the best ways to pack and ship and store his apples. So they were getting the maximum capacity in those barrels of apples that they could. But it's just pretty crazy to think that in 1913, you could get a barrel of apples shipped to you from Watauga County to Baltimore. And it's just another thing that's interesting too, is that like the railroad did not come into Watauga County until 1970.
Okay, I'm ready.
Great, Jean. If you could mute yourself, that'd be awesome.
Sorry.
And here's another receipt. So this is to from Bertha to Mrs. M.D. Long in Asheville, North Carolina. So this is actually to her, to one of her sisters. Her other sister that lived in Asheville, and just another box of apples. Shipping was half the price to get to Asheville as it was to get to Baltimore. And then this one is from Flat Top Manor Orchards. One box of apples to Mrs. Isaac Guggenheimer in Baltimore. So again, I'm putting these up here just to show you that we have physical artifacts of the shipping of apples and the transportation of apples around the country at this time. And it's very significant because this is 1913, this is 1914. And just for Blowing Rock and Watauga County to have, access to ship to Baltimore and Asheville at the time, it really shows how we were connected internationally and around the country at that time. That wasn't as isolated as people really lead to believe sometime. Again, barrel of apples. This one's going to Caesar Cone in Greensboro, North Carolina. So to Moses's brother. And this one's 1915. They're shipping these all over the place. Again, Mrs. Moses H. Cone to Mrs. Etta Cone, Baltimore, Maryland. So this is a picture of an apple from the Parkway. So it's just really interesting to see that they had the ability in the 1913 and 1914 to send apples, to ship them from Blowing Rock to Greensboro. That's a couple days right there, or Blowing Rock to Baltimore. But as we're going to see coming up, they didn't just want people around the country to taste their apples. They wanted people around the world to taste their apples. And they sent their apples to the World's Fair in Paris and were able to win awards. So this is from the State Fair, this is a receipt sending it to the State Fair in Raleigh in 1916. And then here we have an article, prizes for Western North Carolina apples. So the splendid apple exhibit at the State Fair mentioned in last week's Progressive Farmer, the following prizes were awarded. Moses Cone of Blowing Rock, first prize on Gloria Mundi, Royal Limbertwig, Shockley, Fallwater, Grimes Golden, Jonathan, Virginia Beauty, Northern Spy, Ben Davis, Bonham, and York Imperial. I'm amazed that one, there are that many different varieties of apples, but two, that, did anybody else win an award for apples at the state fair that year? Because it looks like Moses swept it. And so earlier when I showed you those USDA renderings of apples, certain ones like the Gloria Mundi, Royal Limber Twig, and Grimes Golden were ones that were pictured then. And a lot of these are varieties that you can still buy today. And of these, my favorites that are listed are the Grimes Golden is like a parent of the Golden Delicious. It's a little crisper. And then the Virginia Beauty is another really incredible apple that you can get locally today. And I'll tell you in a little bit where to get those from. So here's another long range view. This one's from the 20s of Cone Manor. And this one is looking at it from Bass Lake. Now, a couple things stand out to me in this picture. I mean, I walk around Bass Lake regularly, and I can barely see Cone Manor now because the trees have grown up so much. So this was just showing how they had really intentionally molded the landscape to have it be used for orchard production. It's faint, but in the background, you can see vertical lines that are slightly darker. Those are where the rows of apple trees are. Next photo. Okay, and so then this is what I was telling you about. So in 1900, this is the a jury international for apples. And so this is group 8, class 43, first place from the Republic of France for Moses H. Cone of Blowing Rock for his apples. They don't say which apple it was, but he won first place for his apples in France in 1900, which is just pretty incredible that he was able to ship his apples in 1900 from Blowing Rock to France to win awards. And then this is from 1908, again, crediting Moses H. Cone for the National Apple Show in Spokane, Washington. So a first prize. And then Spokane, Washington is the heart of apple country today. So that's pretty significant that he was able to send apples over across country. I mean, it was December, so the weather was colder, so the apples would store better. But Moses put a lot of research into developing methods for keeping the apples cold and through packaging them properly, and helped develop refrigeration in railway cars. So in these articles here, Mr. Cone's Object Lesson from the Farmer and Mechanic in Raleigh in 1902. And so it talks about how he has developed roads on his farm. He built some of the first roads in Blowing Rock to transport his agricultural commodities. And so this article talks about apples, but also cattle, hay, cabbage, oats, corn. He had fish hatcheries on the property as well. So, I mean, when I said earlier that Moses listed himself as a farmer, it is to some merit. You know, he wasn't lying. He actually was doing a lot of farming and production on his property, which is just kind of interesting because you think about the Cone Manor today, you know, and it's mainly just hiking trails and views, and you don't really see many of the remnants of the agricultural heritage there. And then from the Raleigh News and Observer in 1903, North Carolina to be at St. Louis. So for the apple competition in St. Louis. And then here on the right, we see the bronze medal award that Moses was given for his apples at St. Louis. Here's another picture of the orchards, another long range view of the manor, just to really see. I mean, in the foreground, there are those flowering bushes that were planted. In the background, you see the puffballs of the apples on the landscape. And so then this is interesting. We have a lot of their like shipping ledgers. So these show who barrels of apples were sold to and for how much. So the first line says that Joe Gelburn bought 36 barrels at 37.5 cents a barrel. and it went to $13.50 was his balance. So again, I said a barrel's 300 to 350 apples. 36 barrels, that's a lot of apples. You know, it's around like, and then at 37.5 cents a barrel, that translates to $9.73 today. Still, I mean, just incredible prices when you think about it today. You can go buy a quarter peck of apples now, which is probably like 10 to 15 apples for $5. So it's pretty interesting just having these records of where they were sold. There's one person down here who bought 105 barrels of apples, Jim Teague. And we also have records of the pickers and how much the people who picked the apples were paid. And so they averaged to being paid 7 cents a barrel for apples, which goes to $1.84 per barrel. And there are records of some people would pick 20 to 25 barrels of apples a day. And there were records of whole families that would work. So that was one thing that's pretty significant. Besides the fact that Moses was buying 25,000 fruit trees from local nurseries, he was employing hundreds, if not thousands, of local people to pick the fruit. And he built houses for workers on his property. Some of those houses are still existent on the property. He also built a school for the workers, and that school is now Sandy Flats Church over on 221. So they did make a significant impact to the Blowing Rock economy from being here. The first international phone call made in Blowing Rock was made by Etta Cone to purchase paintings in France. The first international postage from Blowing Rock was sent by the Cones to France. And there we have letters in the National Park Service archives of Henri Matisse writing to Moses and Bertha to tell them how much he loved the apples and how those stuck in his memory. So these apples littering the landscapes, just kind of to illustrate, the impact of the apples that of Cone Manor had on the landscape of Blowing Rock. The first railway built in Watauga County. I said earlier that the railroad didn't make it to Watauga County until 1917. Well, years earlier, the first railway was built in Blowing Rock on Cone Manor's property, but it was a mile-long rail car that was meant to transport the apples from the orchards to the packing and processing facility. So just another example of how the Cones made an impact. I mean, they built roads here to transport their apples. They did advertisements for people to come to Blowing Rock to buy their apples. And so I like it that there is the history of Blowing Rock being a tourism hub for people and for the wealthy. But here's an example of people, the wealthy folks from the Gilded Age, directly impacting the economy of the community they're in a positive light. Now, they could have paid their workers more, but at least they were paying them. I'll leave it at that. And so here we've got some more articles. These are from 1902. And so the bottom article is really good. Our Western counties in need of good roads. And so this is a discussion of the Cones' involvement in arguing for improved infrastructure, right? So they helped build roads around here to ship their apples. I mean, and it was just seeing that Moses recognized, he saw the potential in apples for our region. And he made efforts by appealing to local government and then investing with his own money into making making the roads better. Okay, here's some more just nice pictures of the apples from the Parkway. A Fortune in Apples from 1903. Moses Cone expects to make $50,000 by shipping fruit. So Mr. Moses H. Cone of New York, Greensboro, and Blowing Rock was a welcome visitor in the city yesterday. Apart from being one of the most prominent manufacturers in the South, Mr. Cone is gaining a reputation by that immense apple orchard he has planted on his place at Blowing Rock. An observer reporter told us this to Mr. Cone last evening. Mr. Cone laughed and produced a check for $28 that had been sent to him by the Secretary of State Fair as payment for the apples that had won prizes. I'm going to keep that check, he said. I wouldn't take $250 for it. What sort of an apple orchard have you anyway? Asked the reporter. I have 33,000 good trees, which is just incredible. And here we see a portion of that 33,000 good trees. Now, Moses saw the potential of the region in apples. And apple trees are not something that you plant and get immediate return on your investment. You know, some people might say that it's not wise for a businessman to invest in apples and to maintain an orchard because it might take up to 10 years for you to actually start producing yields on this. But Moses had that check for $28 and held it with pride because it showed that his investment was paying off. You know, it's just that there are sayings about, you know, a wise man plants trees in the shade of which he'll never get to sit. Right. So Moses was planting trees for something that he really barely got to see the results of. 1908, he passed away within a year of when that last article was written. So he was starting to see the results of his effort, but didn't really get to see how far it would go. And I can only imagine what he would say if he saw, knew what Bertha was able to do with the orchards after he passed away. So it says here that, oops, sorry, from the Asheville Gazette, that Mrs. Cone's sale of $25,000 worth of apples is the largest apple sale record in the state to date. Right, so it's really great that that Bertha kept it going and just even made it so much more than Moses was able to. Oh, and then here we have the whoops, sorry, go back. Building a railroad. So Mrs. Cone of Blowing Rocks having a railroad 1 mile in length built from her orchard to the packing houses. And this from 1914. So 3 years before Tweetsy Railroad would make its way into Watauga County, Blowing Rock had its own railroad. Now, it's kind of funny that, of course, Blowing Rock would have something just for the rich people before everybody else in the county gets to use it. But that's just a little aside. It's really amazing that they invested that much into making their orchards viable and to be able to ship the apples around the country and around the world. And here you just have this great advertisement. Why not buy direct from the orchard and save the middleman's profit? Prices per barrel. Lenore, North Carolina, as follows. Royal Limber Twig, number one, $3.75. So these prices are from a couple years after those receipts that I showed you and those registers. And also one thing to note is that ledger that I showed you earlier with 37 cents per barrel, those are the wholesale prices. So then for the consumers to come in, I mean, $3.75 for 300, 350 apples is still just incredible. And even when you adjust it for inflation, it's, you know, a nominal amount to pay for that many apples. Here's another, this picture is from the 60s. And so by that time, Bertha passed away in the early 40s. And after she passed away, the land then went to the Cone Memorial Hospital, who then sold it to the Park Service and then the Nature Conservancy. And it has since become Moses H. Cone Memorial Park. And so the apple trees are overgrown and haven't been pruned in decades. So if after hearing about all this, I don't know about you, but I personally am hungry for apples. So where can you eat some of the apples that I have been telling you about? So real quick, just want to share something. If you look on this apple in this picture, there's a couple little black spots on it. Now, this apple, since it is a wild apple, has a couple little skin diseases on it, but there's nothing that affects the flavor or makes it, you know, you don't need to peel the skin or anything. But so it's called sooty fly speck, or the little black dots. And then there's the skin blotches on it. And that's just a little fungus that gets on the skin that other people, like industrial places, spray fungicide on the plants for, but it really doesn't do anything to hurt it. But Bill Moretz of Moretz Mountain Orchard, located on Big Hill Road in Boone, and he's at all the farmers markets and sells through the High Country Food Hub. Now he sells, he has over 150 varieties of apples in his orchard, and he has over 600 trees that he has planted and maintains. It is a third generation apple orchard that was started by his grandfather in the 40s. And Bill has a lot of the varieties of apples that I have mentioned today. The Grimes Golden is one of them, the Virginia Beauty, the Northern Spy, the Jonathan, the Royal Limbertwig. These are all apples that Bill grows. And if you go to the Watauga Farmers Market on Saturdays, he has 20 or 30 different bins of apples out with descriptions next to each one. And same thing, if you go to the High Country Food Hub website, you're able to purchase any of the apples that he grows and has in season right now. It's just, one thing that's interesting about apples is that there's, they don't come all ripe at any one time. The earliest varieties of apples, like the transparent, those come in June or early July. And then the latest batch of apples, which is the Fuji, comes in early November. So there's so many different apples. That's one reason why you have to plant so many varieties, is so that way throughout the season you have different ones coming ripe. So you don't just have a bunch of apples at one time and then they all go bad. It's also really good for disease protection to have a variety of apples. So that way one fungus or one disease or one pest doesn't come in and wipe out your whole crop. But I really recommend the Virginia Beauty and the Grimes Golden. Those are both two delicious apples. Another apple that Bill grows that I didn't talk about earlier is the Winter Banana. That one's currently my favorite. It does not, doesn't have the texture of a banana, but has the flavor. So apples on the estate today. Now, the Cones were definitely people of their time, and they were using a science of their time. And the science of their time told them that lead arsenate was the pesticide to use. So there's one dominant pest for apples that was wreaking havoc on the apple industry from the late 19th century throughout the 20th century, and that is the Coddling Moth. So the Coddling Moth is the reason why we have, the proverbial worm in the apple. Coddling moths lay their larvae in the apple. They eat the apple core out, turned all brown and mealy, and then the worm comes out the side. So lead arsenate was sprayed on the apples or sprayed on the soil or even included in the irrigation water for decades. And it was used predominantly in the US from the 1890s to the 1940s. It was phased out only after the introduction of DDT. And this was because around the time of the 1930s, the moth started to become resistant to the lead arsenate. So the solution that farmers found was just to spray more of it and just to pump more of it on the trees and on the soil. And then DDT came around, and it was so much more effective at killing the moth and killing everything. And also, biological amplification through the food chain, and then leading to the thinning of shells and birds of prey and killing a lot of animals. And then Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. People started to wise up. DDT began to be phased out. And so now we have better pesticides and fungicides that can be used. There's a lot of organic based ones. And some people don't really spray for pesticides. Bill Moretz doesn't really use pesticides, but he uses fungicides. He says those are one big thing that you pretty much have to use. Otherwise, you're going through and thinning things by hand, and nobody has time for that. So the problem with lead arsenate is that it does not dissipate in the soil over time. So if lead arsenate was sprayed on apple trees 100 years ago, it is still in the top layer of the soil today. So if you go to the orchards on Cone Manor, don't eat the dirt. Don't pick up things off the ground and wipe them off and eat them. You can eat the apples. Research that's been done has shown that if you peel the skin, like the arsenic lives more in the skin than in the flesh of the fruit. But where you have real problems are places like in Washington state. They're encountering a lot of issues because old orchard land has been converted into property for development or for schools. And they're actually, they did a survey of the soils across the state in the 90s, and they found like 26 schools were built on retired orchard land that had contaminated soil. And the only way to really remediate the soil is to like flip it with a lower substrate of soil, maybe a foot down to get clean soil on top, to layer new topsoil on top, to cover it with pea gravel. Because otherwise, if the kids are playing in the dirt, they can take in a lot of arsenic. And arsenic isn't as harmful for adults, like in the small amounts you would get through eating the apples, but for children, it can lower IQs, it can lower weight, it can cause forms of cancer later on. And I'm not trying to say like, don't go out and start picking a bunch of the apples on Cone Manor and eating them. I definitely would not do that. But it's just something to really be aware of. And if you buy property that turns out to be on old orchard land, use raised beds if you are going to plant a vegetable garden. And the research that's been done has also said that, if you just like peel it or wash it really well and scrub it, you'll get the arsenic and, laced dirt off, but still those are risks that I don't really want to take. So it is interesting that how something that they were doing to, ensure this business and have it be as profitable as possible and produce as many apples as possible had a legacy that isn't the safest thing. But yeah, so I would not eat the dirt or the apples of Cone Manor. It's interesting that there are natural forms of arsenic out there. There's inorganic and organic arsenic. Organic arsenic occurs in certain plants. And the FDA sets limits for arsenic in the soil or in water or in juice to being 10 parts per billion. And at one point, Dr. Oz got a lot of attention because he tested all these different types of apple juice and found that some contained over 10 parts per billion. This was in 2011, and then the FDA went and did research and tested 63 varieties of apple juice and found none of them contained over 10 parts per billion. And so the issue is arsenic, lead arsenate is not used in America anymore, but it is still used some in China. So a lot of the concentrates for fruit juices like apple juice and grape juice come from China. So that's kind of an issue that people are encountering now. And it's really a bigger thing for children. Arsenic is just kind of an interesting topic. But the legacy of apples right now for the Cone Manor kind of tends to be more in the end that you can't eat the apples there, and you shouldn't because of that. And this research would not have been possible without the help of Carrie Streeter, who was the co-curator on BRAHM's Cone series of exhibits that we had last year, and was a research assistant for the National Park Service and did a lot of the collection of an analysis of the archives of Cone Manor, the National Park Service's archives, the W.L. Urey Appalachian Collection at App State University, and photographer Paul Kelmus. So does anyone have any questions?
I've got some there in the chat. One was, who was his competition on the national market? And were the pickers 100% white folk? And where was the packing facility?
So I don't know about the competition on the national scale. It would have been from Washington State, though, more than from North Carolina. There were African Americans who worked on the property, and they were housed separately and worked separately. It was definitely a segregated facility. The packing facility, I think there was a photo that had it in here. It was on the property. Let me see real quick.
Are these people in that last slide?
Sorry.
were they pickers?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is just a funny photo that I put on here for the questions because I knew there would be some questions about this photo. No, this is from the family world tour that they did. So Moses passed away in 1908 or 1909. And then 2 years before that, the family, Moses, Bertha, and his sisters, Etta and Clarabelle, they took a tour of the world and they met up in Europe and then went all the way around. And so this is a picture of when they were in India and they posed together on an elephant. So these were just some Indian folks that were their tour guides and kind of elephant wrangler there. Yeah, but the packing facility was on the property. I thought I had a photo of it in the slides and I might not have included that one. So all of this was on their property and it would have just been a short drive to town to then get on the Lenore Turnpike and go down, because they would have to carry it by wagon and then later truck down to Lenore to get on the rail cars to go to Greensboro and Baltimore and beyond.
I put a question in the chat too, and that is, weren't the people that picked the apples and took care of the orchards, weren't they given housing as part of their pay?
Yeah, so that was, I think it was in addition to, but they were still paid for the apples they would pick. But yeah, there's houses still. They're kind of those cabins that are over by the manor. And there were more cabins that have since fallen into disrepair. And the Park Service is working on doing some restoration of those. And they have some maps that have the locations of those worker cabins.
And were there packing facilities in those buildings that are off of away from the manor, but on the main property?
That might have been where the packing facility was. There was one main central packing facility on the property that all the apples would go to. And that's what the rail car was used for. So to get more information on the cones, I definitely encourage y'all to check out the Denim King that Beth Davison did. It'll give more of an overview of Moses's entire life and his impact. But the apples were definitely a central part of his identity later in his life and the goals that he had for his property.
Any other questions?
I have just a general question. I see this is being recorded. How would you access the recording if you were not able to be here for the presentation?
I always send these out to the mailing list. So you've gotten every recording I've done through email. So this will be the same.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And then, yeah, and Phoebe just put an interesting comment too, is that public school wasn't mandatory until 1916. So it was a big deal for them to have a school and provide that for them. And, you know, a lot in Appalachian studies and Appalachian history is about business people from outside coming in and exploiting the community. And I think that the story of the Cones and their apples is an example of business people from the outside coming in and making a positive impact on the community, especially when you compare it to other places with what they did with lumber or with coal mining. So it's not a high bar to exceed to support your workers in Appalachia, but the Cones took it seriously and actually cared.
Thanks to Willard for
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, thank y'all for listening and letting me talk at you and your attentiveness. I'm happy to come back some other time and maybe a topic I have a little more expertise on, but I hope that y'all go and give Bill Moretz your business and purchase some apples from him. And if the topic of apples in general is very appealing to you, I'm going to put in the chat. I interviewed Bill Moretz for a Foodways project that we did at the museum a few years ago. And so his interview is just a really great, it's just good. And if you want to learn more about apples and how people use apples, or how apples are produced in the area, I encourage you to read or listen to his interview.
All right, and Phoebe's got a talk this afternoon. Yeah. But I think you have to be through ASU, you have to go through ASU for it.
Phoebe, you're doing the pandemic talk?
You're muted, Phoebe. There you are. Nope.
There you go.
Yes, now.
Mm-mm.
Anyway. Phoebe, I think you might have your computer on mute. Your actual speakers. Huh, okay. Yeah, she's doing the pandemic talk this at 1 o'clock today.
And so Cheryl, you just said you need to register with ASU for that?
Phoebe, we can't hear you, but why don't you type what you're saying? Oh, you did. You have to have an ASU login for that. So, but she'll record it. Huh. All righty. Well, thanks, everyone. I hope to see you back here next week for both of those AARP sponsored presentations. And thank you.
Thanks. And that was great, Willard. That was
Thank
very
you.
interesting.
Thank
Great
you very
job.
much.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks. Hope you all have a great rest of your Friday.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Oh, and Brahm, we just opened a great exhibit about the Koala Arts and Craft Mutual Incorporated, which is the first and largest cooperative of Cherokee artisans in North Carolina. So it's a collection of textiles and weaving and carving and sculpture. So definitely encourage you to come check it out. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 4, free admission.